What was the most disturbing thing you saw in person? About 8 years ago, I working as a train conductor, my locomotive engineer and I hit a young woman with an 8,000-ton freight train traveling 40 mph. After applying the emergency brakes, it was my job to get out and visually check to see if we indeed had an accident. I found her contorted body in seemingly impossible ways near the side of the tracks. I radioed 911 to my dispatcher and emergency services were immediately called. She unfortunately passed away not long after the ambulance arrived. I'm so very sorry you had to be a part of that. You were an innocent person just trying to do a job. That was how my son took his life. I often think of the conductor. I've never met him, her or spoken to him, her. But I wish I could tell them that it was the depression that killed my son. They are completely without blame. And I apologize on his behalf for what they had to live through. One time I was having a sleepover at my friend's house, and she died in her sleep. Waking up seeing her was pretty disturbing. She was 17, I was 15, about 2 weeks before I turned 16. She had epilepsy and had a grand mal seizure in the night. An elderly man on a bike get hit by a truck. I had to hold his head together with my shirt to try and stop the bleeding until the ambulance came. I was no contact with my abusive addict mom for many years. She passed in 2020. A sheriff's deputy found her during a wellness check. It was declared that she had been dead for a couple of weeks in July heat with no utilities. My father and I drove to her house the day after they removed her body. You could smell the decomposition from a block away. She had cancelled trash services and had 3+ years of garbage bags piled to the ceiling in her garage. There were rats running all over the house. 99.9% of our family pictures were pissed on or eaten by rats and not salvageable. Both of her toilets were out of order and full to the brim with crap. Everything I saw in her house was absolute nightmare fuel. A man that was pulled into a wood chipper. Arm and half of head gone before they got it shut down. Was riding with my dad and siblings one morning on our way to school. There's a bridge we drive under every day. That morning we all saw a body hanging from that bridge. When we got home from school, the body was finally in the process of being taken down. When I was about 9 years old, our family was staying at a campground on a river in northern Michigan. A 2-year-old boy had wandered off and was missing. The entire park was looking for him. After about 2 hours with no luck, some of us began looking in the water at the ends of the docks nearby. When I dove down in about 4 feet of water, I found him floating just off the bottom of the river. I pulled him to the surface and shouted for help. The EMTs made an effort to resuscitate him. To no avail. As horrible as that was, the thing that I will never forget was the sound his mother made when I carried him ashore. I still enjoy boating and swimming, but I have a very healthy respect for the water. My best friend and I were supposed to be house sitting, and when we showed up on the first day, the owner, guy who hired us, and his brother were both dead in the house. There was a note and it was ruled a murder-suicide. Younger brother showed up at the house in a drug-fueled rage, and older brother didn't know it was him and shot him. Then when he realized who it was, he wrote a note and killed himself. Someone jumping off of a building. I'm haunted by the mental image of blood, cranial matter splattered around a very limp body. Motorcycle rider missing their head. Launched across highway. Run over by numerous cars before traffic stopped. Head was removed with helmet. Probably seeing the burn marks on a pediatric patient who was desperate for help due to persistent SAW from a family member. Never been so pissed in my life at someone I had never met. Wish I could have broken the perpetrator's orbitals, so he could never look at another child the same way again. As in, they burned themselves in order to get taken to a hospital so they could say what was happening. Yes. Thankfully there was no SAW involved at the time, but unfortunately this reminded me of a super not fun patient I had. 3-year-old girl, still in diapers. Full and partial thickness burns over about 30 to 40% body surface area. Essentially nipples to knees. Thankfully only on the front and not circumferential. Walked into a house that was clearly being squatted in. Trash piles and filth everywhere. Holes in the roof. Most of the top floor charred from a fire. Mom is there and says it's from boiling water and is being dodgy with everything else. Dad booked it when he found out someone called 911. Patient was laying on a couch, obviously crying. But not with as much energy as we like to see. Crying kids are alive kids. And she looks like she was running out of energy to cry. No tears left and dry lips. Bad signs. She was wearing only a diaper that looked like it hadn't been changed for quite some time. No attempt to bandage or cover her burns at all. Not that they would have done the correct thing treatment-wise, but it would have at least shown they attempted to do something about it. Her burns are old, too, so don't forget to mention that. When you nominate them for Parent of Year, Auntie shows up about 2 minutes after I do. I get the story from her. They have a hot plate as a stove in the one good room upstairs. They were boiling water to cook noodles on it, and since it's the only good bedroom in the house, it's where she was, and she was jumping on the bed and knocked it over onto herself. About 36 hours ago. Mom and Dad never called. Her uncle shows up to visit, and that fucking idiot never called either. Thankfully, Auntie notices him acting all bothered about something and she finally asks him what his deal is and he replies, "Oh, the burns all over my niece are really bothering me. I hope she's okay." So the only person with any goddamn sense finally calls 911 for this kid. Thankfully, I was able to get an IV on her, she needed fluids badly. This was before we had ketamine in the drug box, which is great for pain management and sedating children, both of which this poor girl needed, because as soon as we get to the hospital there's going to be like 7 doctors examining your painful burns, which is distressing enough to an adult, let alone this poor girl. I used what I had, and gave her more fentanyl than you should for someone that size, hoping to give her at least a little bit of respite over both the past and incoming shitty days she was about to have. For you non-medical folks, don't worry. I had both equipment to breathe for her and Narcan ready. I also straight up tattled on myself when I got to the hospital. Understandably, in this scenario, nobody gave a shit. I hope she's doing okay now, that was a while ago. I worked in a group home for kiddos with severe psychiatric illnesses for a while. Most of our clients were abuse victims, and we had a beautiful little blonde girl who had been sexually assaulted repeatedly and severely by an uncle. We were only supposed to keep kids for 6 months or so, but we had that little one for like 4 years. The system was hellbent on reunifying this little one with her family, so she started going on weekend passes back home to grandma's house. When she would return, she would mention that her uncle, perpetrator, was there. Huge no-no. I just remember we all wrote letters to the judge, reporting that and saying we didn't think she needed to go back. And by we I'm talking several clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, and facility staff. Judge sent her home anyway. Uncle raped her again almost immediately, and she set herself on fire to keep him from touching her. Within a week of leaving our facility she was in a burn unit in St. Louis. This was 10 to 15 years ago. I saw a lot of awful stuff working that job. But that situation is what made me say I can't do this anymore. I was so heartbroken that the system failed her and that was with everyone knowing, with her getting removed from the home, getting intensive treatment, and for what? I don't know if it's the same little person you're talking about, but the fact there might be more kids in a situation where literally setting yourself on fire is a better alternative than horrific abuse is even more depressing. Are there just zero repercussions for judges after these kind of blatantly wrong decisions that end tragically? If you put a kid in a cage with a tiger you would land in jail, but put it in a home with their known abuser and you get to stay a respected member of society? For real, that judge should also be incarcerated because they're basically an accomplice at that point. Read that as incinerated and did not disagree. Sadly not the same girl. Literally have chills, goosebumps, and tears right now reading that story because of how eerily similar it is. The system is fucked and I hate the notion that we can do everything to help these kids only for some pinhead with no real life experience, only a fancy degree, to undo all the progress that was made in helping to heal these kids from the trauma they endured. This fucking shatters me. I survived a rape and did something similar. I remember the look in the psych ward worker's eyes. It was just horror and heartbreak. I was hospitalized and I'm recovered now. But this makes me choke up. Poor babe. When I was in 8th grade, there was a girl in my class who was being severely abused by her family, in about every way imaginable. Her locker was right next to mine, so I talked to her more than most of the other kids in our class. One day she told me she stabbed herself in the foot and I was so freaked out that I told my mom, who worked for the school and was a mandated reporter. She left our school after that because she was finally removed and put in a group home. She also had special needs, fetal alcohol syndrome, and needed extra support. At the time, I didn't realize that she had probably done that on purpose because I was so sheltered and the whole seriousness of the situation just went entirely over my head. I was mostly concerned that her foot was going to be infected. Years later, I found out that in addition to not being fed or bathed, her older brothers were violently raping her and her younger sister. Makes me sick to think about still. A prisoner with his throat cut and his lunch coming out. Yup, and this is as far down as I'm going on this thread. Was walking through a city with a friend when we saw a guy on a bike, no helmet, come down a steep street right in front of us. Something made his bike flip and he went headfirst onto the stone cobble street. The cracking noise and the amount of blood was something I'm not going to forget any time soon. Ambulance and so on showed up pretty fast, but I have no idea if he survived. I'd like to think so, but there was so much blood on the street I don't know if I can believe it. Watched a woman get stabbed to death by her baby daddy in front of their kid. He said later he did it cause he didn't want her to take care of the kid. Happened right outside my school too. Human body parts moments after they got hit by a semi-truck. An arm about 35 feet from the head. My father killed himself by stepping out in front of a semi-truck on the freeway this last summer. I feel horrible for the driver of that truck and I think about him all the time. Why the fuck am I even reading these? The so-called caring, loving Christian church I will never go back to after tonight. Invite homeless people for a midnight dinner. Then telling them they can't have a plate, unless they pay $3 for it. The pastor took a plate out a homeless dude's hand and said God would feed him. I left my wallet at home and they didn't even let me, a member of the church, get a plate for my 2-year-old son who was crying. They said let the paying Christians eat first and then if there was leftovers we can have some, when he said God willing and amen. I had to hold back from punching him. I left early and decided after that experience I'm never going back to church. Tonight broke my heart. I've given up so much for this church. Only now do I realize. The credit card readers for donations. Twice a service probably isn't going to feed the homeless like they say. But to buy all those fancy flat screens LG brand TVs all over the church. The pastor has rims on his car. I've been a idiot. While some of the messages were good. After them doing what they did tonight. I'll never go back. Edit. My wife isn't talking to me because I cussed out the pastor and smacked a plate out his hand. Causing a scene. I probably shouldn't have done that. But I was legit upset nobody else saw anything wrong with this. I cooked and brought food to this event, and was told I couldn't get a plate. My wife will get over it in the morning. But yeah, tonight I'm sleeping on the couch. You cussing out the pastor reminds me of the cleansing of the temple. The story of when Jesus gets pissed at all the profiteers and flips all their tables over. Your wife shouldn't be mad at you. You are the most righteous Christian there, you rule. Nurse, trauma code on a middle-aged gentleman who wrecked his car. Basically dead on arrival and didn't make it. The ambulance that dropped him off had to do a speed clean of the bloody gurney to rush out to another call immediately. 30 min later it brings in an old lady who had fallen at home. She kept saying she can't get a hold of her son and he was supposed to take her to the hospital. Turns out her son was the one who wrecked his car on his way to take his mom to the hospital. And she was brought in on the same gurney that her dead son was just laying on moments earlier. That was a gut punch having to tell her the bad news. This was in a rural community with limited ambulance service. One time I tried to take my son to the family bathroom at Target and saw 2 meth heads going at it. I watched a guy get sucker punched outside a club, not uncommon where I used to live. But he fell back and hit his head and a pool of blood started spreading from the back of his head. I always wonder whether he died, had long-lasting damage. A person with half their head gone because of attempted suicide with a shotgun. Doctors doing CPR in vain on my 8-day-old, 1lb15 Oz daughter. The palm of their hands were bigger than her little body. That image will never leave my mind. NICU nurse here, we never forget either. I'm very sorry for your loss. Driving in Washington state. Someone in a car the size of a Toyota Corolla went head-on with a semi. There were body parts and goo all over the road, no survivors in the car. They had to get the jaws of life out to get enough remains to have something to bury. Almost 25 years later, seeing a severed hand being picked up by EMS still haunts me. Domestic abuse in the middle of a street. I thought they were strangers and that she was trying to get away from him and he wouldn't accept it. He kept holding on to her and trying to drag her with him while she kept begging him to let her go. We stopped and she looked at us and asked for help. He took off when he saw us walk towards them. She then let us know that they were married, but at least she wouldn't get beaten up that night since we interfered. She would go spend the night at her sister's place, and she wouldn't divorce him because there were kids involved. I hope she did end up divorcing him, and those kids weren't too scarred of having to survive growing up with their father beating their mother. I saw a guy's leg shredded by recycling truck that didn't see him. It was something out of a human anatomy textbook. You could see every muscle and bone from thigh to shin. The poor dude was still alive in extreme pain. As the ambulance came to get him, he looked so pale and cold. I found out he died shortly after. A kid in kindergarten flattening a living hedgehog with a spade, laughing all the while. He went on to rape a girl with a ruler while still at primary school. Yep, that's enough Reddit for this year. See you in 2024. I don't want to imagine what made a kid that fucked up that early on. Witnesses a rollover during a blizzard. I called for emergency services as I approached and assessed the situation. One of the occupants was partially ejected through the sunroof and had his head pinned beneath the vehicle. He was alive and conscious but in dire need of extrication. He was screaming about the pressure. Myself and others arriving collected vehicle jacks and began trying to lift the vehicle off of him. We were making good progress. We had managed to make some space for him, but he was still stuck when the firemen arrived and took over. They replaced our jacks with dunnage, think wooden railway ties, in a stack and then used airbags to lift the vehicle. Unfortunately, as the weight of the vehicle was taken by the airbags, everything slid and the dunnage collapsed. The vehicle landed full force on his head again with a sickening crunch, and that was it. I had almost gotten this man out, but the professionals took over and killed him in front of me. Entering a friend's place for the first time without prior knowledge that he is a hoarder at age 40. Total shock. Dude has normal job, friends etc., but an absolute hoarder. Dead mice in the flat. Trash in the kitchen reaching almost to the ceiling. Mold everywhere on one wall of the bedroom. I didn't dare to use the bathroom, utter shock. My own mother being attacked by a dog while holding the cat I had grown up with. Our neighbors raced greyhounds and our cat was sunbaking outside on the veranda. One of their greyhounds had escaped the pen they were housed in and wasn't wearing a muzzle. Unfortunately, our cat was the first live thing the dog spotted at the same time my mother walked out the front door. She tried quickly grabbing the cat, but by the time she had gotten to him the dog had reached our veranda, knocking my mother off onto the ground a few feet down, and began to fight for both of their lives. Luckily I was home at the time, as well as my father, who was asleep after a long night at work. I heard her screams for help, ran outside to the scene and was stunned for a few moments before screaming for my father, who raced outside to try separating the dog from them both, who had by this time ripped shreds into my mother's arms and dislocated our cat's hip, but luckily both were alive. A ranger and ambulance was called, and then a few days later police attended, although when they approached our neighbors to locate the dog they had hidden it away on another property, which was eventually located. To this day, years on, they have never approached any of us to apologize. My neighbors did the same shit when their husky killed a stray cat I was feeding, on my property, and attacked me when I tried to drive it off. My leg was left with big gashes, and I put the dog's eye out accidentally while defending myself with a stick I grabbed. The neighbors whisked the dog away somewhere, tried to sue me over its eye, and have never apologized. Years later, they now have an uncontrollable Rottweiler that almost rushed my terrier the other day because these morons don't lock their yard upright. It'll kill someone eventually. Around the age of 5 I was living with my family on my grandfather's farm. One day while my father was working I was home alone with my mother. She went to take a bath while I was watching TV. After my show ended I realized she wasn't anywhere in the living room, kitchen, or master bedroom. It was a trailer home, so not big. I went to check the only bathroom and she was completely submerged underneath the bathwater from having a seizure. I ran to go get my grandfather and called 911 like I was taught as he tried to revive her via CPR. The paramedics eventually arrive and are able to revive her, but only for a brief period before her heart gives out again and they pronounce her dead. TLDR. I found my mother's corpse when I was 5. Edit. Didn't exactly think this would blow up this much. Thank you for all the kind words. I'm 30 now, so I've had more than enough time to cope. Watched my mum's friend's boyfriend insert steak knives into his girlfriend while they had a rough domestic. I was 12 and my mum was too cooked to help. The way you wrote insert steak knives into made me picture it in a much more casual and relaxed setting than I'm sure it actually was.